Hi, welcome back. So this is a continuation from the last video where we learned about the div and the span, and in this one we are going to continue with the class and the ID, right? So with the div and the span, we saw how we can select pretty specific elements of the page or pretty specific areas of the page without actually having to worry about if they are in the same element or paragraph or h1. They could be anywhere and you could arbitrarily choose to select them and leave everything else out. However, I have another scenario here. Let's remove this div. Yeah, so this div is removed. And so what I'll do now is I'll make another h2. I'll give this the last sub heading of the page. And if I refresh, I see this is what I get, right? All of this is inside a span, and if I cut it and put it here, I see all of this is inside of span and nothing else is styled because we've put a color of green to div, but we have not wrapped anything inside of a div. So I'll just do some nice spacing here and I'll put comments saying first, second, and what we're now going to make is the third, right? And what I'm going to do in the third is I'm going to again add a paragraph, lorem 100. And if I refresh, I see I have a page here, right? And I have some good amount of content on it. So let's imagine that for some particular application, I want this to be green, I want all of this to be red, and then I want all of this to be blue, right? So how will you do that? You want to style three different things in three different ways. So how do you do that? Because if you wrap this inside of a div, one thing that we know that if whenever we want to style anything differently from the other page, we would wrap it inside of a div or a span. Normally, if it's not a single element. If it's a single element, there's another way, and that is exactly what we're seeing. But for now, if I make another div and I move out both of these up into that div, so I have all of these three paragraphs inside separate divs right now. Still, if I refresh, I see all of them turn green. Why? Because I've given a color of green to a div, right? And I removed the span here because it's distracting. And where's the ending tag? Here it is. Alright, so if I refresh again, I see all of this is green because I've given a color of green to div. However, imagine a scenario where I just explained the scenario that you want a different color on this, a different color on this, and a different color on this. So we can see that that's not possible using just divs, right? And even if you use a span, then there will be two elements and you'll be able to style two things differently and not three things or not 10 things when you have different 10 paragraphs on your page. So how do you do that? So that we can do by assigning specific IDs or classes to a particular element on the page. So what are IDs and classes? IDs and classes are simple things that you would assign to something as identifiers. So to explain that, let me just first show you what they are. So basically both of them are attributes, right? So if I do a class is equal to, I'll first show you ID. We've also used ID in the form thing, and I told you that it's a unique identifier for any element on the page, right? And that's only thing that it is. That is the only thing. So I could give it ID of, let's say, green. I'll remove the style from for now. And if I refresh, I see I have nothing here. So that is because we have identified this element as something different. However, we have not styled it. So now, instead of styling all divs, we can style the div with ID is equal to green as having color of green. So how do you do that? So in CSS, to select an ID, you would first put a hash and then you would put an ID name. So this ID is named green, so you would do hash green, and that would mean that we are selecting the thing on the page that has ID is equal to green, right? So this is our selector, and then we do something like color green, and I see that if I refresh, only this turns green. Even though all of these are inside different div tags, I only had to style ID of green, which is this div tag right here, and it turned green. Only this turned green, and all of the other things remained unstyled. So if I do a similar thing on this, I give it ID is equal to, and you could give any random ID. I'm giving green because it's usually good to have understandable names for things on your web page. However, you could do something like ID is equal to ABCD, and that's perfectly fine. And when you go up here in styles, you'll simply do hash ABCD, because hash is to represent that we are selecting an ID, and then the next following letters are for the name of the ID. And then inside you could do color, and I don't know what I said for this. I'll just do red, and if I refresh, I see both the elements inside this ABCD ID turn red, right? So that is what an ID can help you do. You can assign it to a specific element on the page, and then you can style that specific portion by itself without affecting any other thing on the whole page. And now if I want to change this last one to be blue, I'll do div ID is equal to blue, and I'll have to style this too. If I do hash blue, color blue, now if I refresh, I see this turns blue. So this is what we wanted, and you could do this infinitely, and you could have any number of IDs on your page. That's never a problem. Whenever you give an ID, you'd specifically go to that ID, you would style it according to your need, and that would do your job for you. Now, one thing I want to show you in ID is that it is not that you can give IDs only to divs. If I remove this ID from here and I give this to this paragraph, and this is because there's only one paragraph inside of this div, so there's no point in making a separate div for this, and if I refresh, I see nothing changes because the paragraph still has an ID of green, right? And to demonstrate this better, I'll move this h2 inside the div too. Now if I refresh this, I see it doesn't change. However, if I apply this ID of green, to this div, I see this h2 turns green too. So anything inside of a div with ID is equal to xyz or anything, and if we apply some styles to that ID, everything inside of the div will be affected. And not just div, if you have anything inside of the element having the ID, it will be affected. If it's a div or if it's a span, or you could apply an ID to the body, although that's not very logical because you will not have more than one body on your page, right? So, but it is possible. You could apply anything to anything here, right? So that's what you have for IDs. Now what a class is, now we had three things there, right? Div, span, class, and ID. We had four things. We have got three out of them. So what's a class? So imagine you had to put the same styles to this, this, and this right here, but you did not want to apply any styles to this. Because if you wanted to apply styles to all of this, you would have wrapped all of this in a single div, and then you would have given an ID to that, and then applied the red color, let's say. But you do not want to change this. You want to change only this, this, and this. So how do you do that? One thing could be that we see that this has an ID is equal to blue, and hence we go in here, we change this to red 2, and if I refresh, I see this is something that I wanted. However, imagine having 20 elements on your page and you want to apply the same 20 styles to all of them. Then you will be writing 400 lines of code when you could do that thing simply by 20 lines. And how you could do that thing by 20 lines is by using a class. So an ID is an identifier, we know that, but it is a unique identifier for all the elements, right? However, a class is something that you can give to multiple elements of your page. So what I mean is, you could give it a class is equal to ABCD, and then you could give this div a class is equal to ABCD2. Now both of them have the same class, and normally you would group similar data in the same class, and then you would style that particular class only. However, there's still a problem with our code, and let's see what that is. We see that this color of red is not applied to this div or this div. So the reason behind that is that this hash represents that we're using an ID. To represent a class, you would use a dot, right? And if you do a dot ABCD and you refresh, you'll see all of this turns red. And here we have only reduced the 3 lines. There was hash blue styling that we had here. But imagine again having 20 elements and 20 styles to all those elements, and you want to apply the same thing. Then having 20 IDs is definitely not something you would do. You would apply the same class to all of them, and then you would style that particular class, right? And this is extremely helpful whenever you're styling a web page, because you will have to group similar data into similar things, and you will have to apply some properties to some things and other properties to other things, right? For that you would use a class. And one more thing that let's say I wanted to apply a border, and I'm first styling the class naming give border, and I do a border of 2px solid black. So now we want to apply this give border class to all the elements on which we want a border on our page. Let's say I want a border on this element right here and this element right here, right? Or I want a border on this and this, the first and the last paragraphs. So it's easy for the first paragraph. So the first thing is you can have a class and ID both for a single element, and that's never a problem. So I can put a class is equal to give border here. Now if I refresh, I see this gets a border. However, we don't want this on the H2. So what we are going to do is we are going to move this on the paragraph. Again, you can have a class, just like an ID, you can have a class on any element of your page. And if I refresh, I see only this paragraph gets a border, right? And we'll also add a nice padding of, let's say 5 pixels, no, 10 pixels. So this looks better now. Right, so we have given a class of give border to this. Now we want a border on this too. So one thing you could do is you could do class is equal to give border on this paragraph right here. And that will work fine, and that is not something that you wouldn't do. I'm not saying this is not good practice or something, it removes the wrong class. This is definitely something you can do, but I want to show you something here, and that's why I'm going to put the class on this div rather than on the paragraph. However, that would not make a difference in the look of this page. So what I initially thought when I was learning, that we would do a class is equal to give border again, and now then we'll refresh. However, I see that does not affect my page, and that is because this is not a way to give multiple classes. You can, first of all, you can have multiple classes for a single element, that is perfectly fine. And how you add them is that you do one class name and then a space, and then you give the second class name. So now this div has two classes, ABCD and give border at the same time. And if I refresh, I see this gets a border, nice border, right? And one thing that we have learned from this is that you cannot have a space in class name or in ID name. You will not have a space in any names to anything that you're giving in any kind of development, right? In any language, or whether it be web development, front end, back end, or even if you go out of the scope of web development into other languages and you go into some, even if you go into every language on this planet, Java, Python, I've studied a lot of them. So you cannot have a space in any identifier name. You cannot have a space in ID name, you cannot have a space in class name or anything, right? You can have something like this if you want to separate your words, but you cannot have a space. So that's it. And we see that now we have a flexibility to apply any style to any element of the page, and we can choose not to affect all the other elements while doing so. And that is what selecting specific areas means. So just a recap, div and span are used for selecting specific area of the page and then styling that. And class and ID are attributes, right? And that you can assign to any element of the page, and then you can style that particular class or that particular ID, and the changes will reflect only on the elements who have been assigned to that particular class or ID. The difference between a div and span is that a div is a block level element and a span is an inline element. And the difference between a class and ID is that ID is unique for all the elements of the page, and a class can be the same for many elements of the page, or many elements of the page can have the same class, right? So that is it for selecting specific areas and this particular video too. So I'll see you in the next one.